So this follows on very neatly. I'm going to take us from one UN conference in Paris to another in the Pacific. And I want to do this by talking about the island of hope. This is a Pacific homegrown nexus of ideas that has lots of different roots. It's been drawn together in a very effective way. And it really characterizes and configures the Pacific's response to climate change. And what I want to do is to illustrate that, but also to help us to think how this idea of the island of hope and the Pacific response to climate change might help us to think about an anthropological response to climate change. So moving from Paris to Samoa and to the SIDS conference, the Small Island Developing States Conference that was held in September 2014, I want to base these reflections on what the Samoans were doing when the world came to Samoa and how they used that opportunity to shape the outcomes in rather unexpected ways. One of the things that happened, one of the many things that happened at the SIDS conference was that the hukalea, a very important voyaging canoe, was brought into the bay of Apia. And at one time, the head of state invited the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on board. Now, this boat is enormously important. It was built in the 70s. It's been an important part of a Polynesian Renaissance, a wider Pacific rediscovery of a sense of pride and identity as sailors, of groups of people who sailed the Pacific, found islands, and settled them. Ban Ki-moon was taken on board, and he offered these reflections. Like many other people, they were struck that they'd flown over a great deal of ocean to get to Samoa. So we're all on the same small island, he means Samoa, on the same small planet Earth. This is like a small boat in the universe. Now, this image of a voyaging canoe, a traditional voyaging canoe, on its way to an island, I think is worth reflecting upon. This image of a world in a boat, of course, is nothing new to people in the Pacific who were used to taking their world with them when they explored and settled the Pacific. But as I say, this is an alternative image that I want us to take seriously as those images that are much more familiar to us, the image of Spaceship Earth and the image of Earthrise. I think this image here is more forceful in the Pacific, and I want to try and unpack that. Those images of Earthrise and Spaceship Earth, of course, have been attributed with the explosion of ecological consciousness in the late 60s and early 70s. But this image of the Earth as a voyaging canoe and of the Earth as an island, it's very different. Rather than those images of isolation, of limits, of self-containment, these images have social relations integrally implied. And I think it's for that reason that they're homegrown and much more forceful images in the Pacific. But how can we understand this? Now, of course, there's no corollaries to nature and culture in the Pacific. What we would grasp as the environment is actually wrapped within social relations. The lands, the oceans, the sky, beings of all different kinds are all malleable. They're all plastic. They all change. They all transform. And they manifest and express particular social forms. There's nothing beyond the social, as it were. Climate and weather, then, are barometers, so to speak, that register the qualities and the changes in social relations and people's dealings with one another. Climate change is taken as relations between specific ideas, relations between humans and relations of all kinds, and the focus on form of these relations with which the changeable form of the world reflects. And of course, there's a particular emphasis on the form of relations here, the aesthetic form of sociality, the containment of efficacy. Here, the form of knowledge is just as important as its content. It's the form and quality of relations that holds efficacy for guiding and achieving particular effects. And let me illustrate how this works. And I'll do this through this island of hope idea that emerged from the Pacific Council of Churches about 15 years ago in 2001. The idea of the island of hope, of course, has this idea of a kingdom of heaven on earth But specifically in a Pacific context, it's a place that Pacific peoples and only Pacific peoples can see, can navigate to. They're using their traditional navigational skills. They're rediscovering this. And they're steering and guiding and carrying the world towards this place where sustainable development will be carried out through Pacific values and through Pacific ways. The connections that Pacific peoples make will be the basis for an engagement in the world. It carries as well a very hard-hitting and thoroughgoing Pacific critique of economic globalization. And it's hard to say that it's just one thing. It's a cultural idea, it's an environmental discourse, it's a theological prophecy, a political ideology, and a cosmological vision. And it's a key regionalizing and motivating principle. So, for example, the colonial era governance structures are being challenged by the Pacific Islands Development Forum, which includes many of the thinkers who first were involved in the Island of Hope. And it's been propagated into a new generation of Pacific leaders as a kind of theology and philosophy combined. They're rethinking the way that the governance of the Pacific is thought about. And you can see, as I've already illustrated, how the Pacific Voyaging Society has rediscovered these skills. And as Vili mentioned, you've got young people in the Pacific now sailing their canoes into the harbours of coal ports and trying to stop things. So this voyaging is about climate change awareness, and it's also characterising the campaign ethics. And I think we can also see this at the UN SIDS conference in 2014, where the Island of Hope provided both the means and it provided the ends. It was done in a very distinctive Pacific way. The SIDS, as I'm going to show you and argue, the SIDS event was contained and carried by a Pacific voyaging vessel. The Samoa Pathway, the outcome document, was explicitly imagined as a voyaging canoe. The partnerships, the emphasis on partnerships, public, private, south-south, north-south, these were imagined as many paddlers sitting in our canoe. You can paddle as hard as you like, but we're going in our direction. And so this is what it looked like. This is the architecture of this, the canoe. It's a building which we might say is double-hulled. There are two banks of seating for the spectators. Along the side, you'll be able to see paddles were put up. On the roof, there is the sky and the clouds. And probably this idea and these imageries were over the heads of the speakers. But if they turned, they would see these collages of a voyaging canoe and a long canoe that's paddled by many people. And the CEO coordinator of SIDS explained that this wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just decoration. There was a real thought had been put into this, and real hope for putting the paddles along the balustrades. The long canoe was to illustrate this voyaging culture. So the architecture of the building was deliberately appropriated and made into a voyaging canoe. The ceiling and the sky and the ocean was to reflect those relationships that I began talking about. They did more than this. What was really striking was that as soon as you left the airport, you were contained within this hospitality. For 20 kilometers from the airport into the main city of Apia, it was just a continuous stream of welcoming banners and streamers and bunting with all sorts of messages like handmade sheets from schools and church groups, open your heart, etc. There was a lot of preparation that had gone into making this space for SIDS. And again, there was a great deal of community work, but there was a great deal of effort and deliberately hard effort. What they were trying to do was to create a space where the Holy Spirit would be able to counter the forces of globalization. So there was this corridor of flags and banners, and this carries this Polynesian idea of wrapping and containing important powers. We were within this corridor the whole time. We were carried by these ideas. We were, the efficacy that they'd drawn and attracted was carried by this vessel and by these ideas. Church communities had fasted and prayed for 40 years, for 40 days. So you can see the effort that's gone into this. The Samoan Prime Minister in his closing statement then revealed to everyone what had happened is that they had been contained by this vessel and that the Samoan pathway would carry them together in a future direction. There's something else that was going on at the same time, which is that the head of state of Samoa, his words about Pacific indigenous navigation as a powerful metaphor for Pacific leadership, he has these important words about the kinds of connections that went into navigation. It wasn't just looking at the stars. There were all sorts of relationships that were brought together. And there was this notion of tofa siali, of reaching out for wisdom, of relations, of building knowledge with and through others. And all of this was going on very clearly at the SIDS conference. So back to this image. There was a heavy-handed and very clear critique from the Pacific about climate change and about globalization at SIDS. And perhaps now we can understand the Hawaiian master navigator, Naona Thompson, when he says, "We are on the wrong sail plan." So this has forced us to think what an appropriate anthropology would look like if it was sourced in these Pacific social forms. And like Thompson, we've been asking ourselves whether anthropology is on the right sail plan. When we've been forced to begin with sociality and cosmology to understand how the causes of change are understood, rather than beginning by assuming that the causes, as they're understood in the Pacific, are understood as carbon forcing or climate change, and then only to look to culture after the fact. That just hasn't worked in the Pacific. This social constructionist position of different people making different things from the same natural facts, that struggles in the Pacific. All too quickly we run into our own assumptions. And finally, it should be Anthropology 101 to start with other people's assumptions, rather than beginning with our own. And I think one of the things that the Island of Hope and working in the Pacific and thinking about climate change has helped us to understand is that some of the connections that are made very clearly and explicitly in the Pacific, they're harder to disconnect there, and they seem to be easier to disconnect in some of the scholarly responses. So, for example, it's impossible to separate out theology and cosmology in the Pacific. Indeed, those issues would have more of a presence than they might have had here. Indeed, they are the object of the Island of Hope.